Ask your doctor if my drug is right for you. Does anybody still remember a time when it was possible to watch TV without seeing a prescription drug commercial that usually ends with a sentence very similar to this one? Turns out that actually wasn't too long ago, because only in the mid-90s did pharmaceutical companies start advertising their prescription drugs to the end consumers using commercials like this one. And if you're an immigrant like me, then you probably are not familiar with this type of commercial either, because this exact format is only legal in the US and in New Zealand. Now, you're probably not surprised to hear that prescription drugs are a multi-billion-dollar industry. Over 70% of Americans take at least one prescription drug, thereby generating $380 billion in sales every year. Just this state, Buckeyes contribute $14 billion to this overall statistic. That is over $1,000 per person per year. You may also know that the pharma industry is highly competitive. There are currently 140 prescription drugs out there to treat high blood pressure. So it may then not come as a surprise excuse me, that pharma companies spend a lot of money advertising to the end consumer. $6 billion in 2016. But what is weird about prescription drugs is that, unlike most products, you can't just walk into a store and buy them after you've seen your favorite prescription drug commercial on TV. You need somebody's permission to buy them. That's why at the end of every commercial, you usually see a sentence very similar to these. Ask your doctor if my drug is right for you. And this is where things get interesting, because now you might ask yourself, if doctors have all the prescribing power, why aren't pharma companies advertising to them? Well, it turns out they do. Not just a little, but 3 times more than to the end consumer. $20 billion in 2016. Now, $12 billion come in the form of free samples. The remaining $8 billion mostly come in the form of office detailing. You know, a sales representative walking into a doctor's office, bringing them a free lunch, inviting them out for dinner, even taking them on cruises, all in exchange for being allowed to tell them about the newest prescription drug on the market. To give you an idea from my own personal life, how frequent office detailing has become, here is a sign that is posted outside of my primary care physician's office. It is asking sales representatives to please come back on days where he's less busy with patient visits. So, is office detailing a bad thing? In theory, no, right? Because it informs doctors about newer and better ways to treat certain conditions. But this is where the economist in me gets very skeptical. After all, economics is called the dismal science for a reason. All economists, whether we study healthcare markets, financial markets, labor markets, we're all concerned about incentives, more specifically the unintended consequences to which they might lead. So what could possibly go wrong when we allow pharma companies to advertise to doctors? To get a rough understanding, we may look at the lobbying industry. We all know that lobbying typically doesn't create benefits for the population as a whole, but only for certain special interest groups. And if you think lobbyists spend a lot of money on advertising or lobbying to politicians in Washington, you're certainly right. However, pharma companies spend just as much money on advertising to doctors as lobbyists spend in Washington. So then, does office detailing affect the doctor's opinion like lobbying affects politicians? There exists research that shows that office detailing, in fact, does lead to higher prescribing frequency, lower prescribing quality, and higher healthcare costs. So in other words, there's evidence that office detailing creates a dissonance between the Hippocratic oath, do no harm, and the incentives provided by pharma companies to doctors, namely to prescribe their drug over the right drug. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that all doctors can be bought by pharma companies, but we know that advertising has an effect on people. Doctors are people. So let's come back to my primary care physician. You know, the guy that gets so busy with sales representative visits that he's asking them to please come back on days where he's less busy with patient visits. Naturally, I wonder whether he has received payments for the drugs that he's prescribing me. Now, it turns out that I can look that up. Because starting in 2013, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services started publishing data that made transparent the financial relationships between a physician and a pharma company. Among other things, they published the doctor's name, the doctor's address, the pharma company, the amount the pharma company paid the doctor, the drug they paid the doctor for, and much more. Now, just to be clear, I've made up these doctor names and their addresses, and I've censored the pharma companies and the drug names just because I don't want to single anybody out, okay? So now, this before-mentioned dissonance between the Hippocratic Oath and the incentives provided by office detailing create a lot of interesting research questions. And thanks to this very detailed data provided by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, we can try to answer some of them. Take the opioid crisis, for example. Just last year, 47,000 people died from prescription drug overdoses. Here in this state, Ohio, that contributed 10% to this overall statistic. Also last year, the New York Times published an article that described the role played by a pharma company in advertising their prescription opioids to physicians. And while a lot of pharma companies engage in this practice, the one mentioned in this article was particularly effective in misrepresenting facts about the potential of opioid addiction and opioid abuse. Originally, it was even suggested that opioids are being used for common aches, like back pain or knee pain, which now, after everything we know about opioids, seems about as ridiculous as this 1885 commercial to use cocaine to treat toothaches. So now you might ask yourself, well, did this prescription opioid-related payments actually lead to higher opioid prescriptions? Researchers from the University of Georgia, Indiana University, and the National Bureau of Economic Research asked exactly that question. And they did find that physicians who received opioid-related payments prescribed significantly more opioids than physicians who did not receive such payments. They also found that an increase in payments leads to more opioid prescriptions. Now, another question we could ask ourselves is related to the controversial topic of medical cannabis. As so often nowadays, medical cannabis or opinions about medical cannabis are split, broadly speaking, along political lines. One group often argues we should not allow cannabis because it's a gateway drug. The other group often points towards evidence that suggests that medical cannabis has been very effective in treating certain conditions, including chronic pain, which is why some have also argued that medical cannabis might actually help curb the opioid epidemic. Now, medical cannabis, we all know, is a growing market in the US. There is currently 33 states that have some type of cannabis laws on the book. These are the states that you see in green here. The ones in dark green, in addition to medical cannabis, have also recreational cannabis laws. Not only do a lot of states have medical cannabis laws, these states also create a lot of revenue from it. $8 billion in 2016. Just the state of Michigan contributed $600 million to this overall statistic. Now, Michigan is actually an interesting case because medical cannabis has been legal there since 2008. However, up until today, there is still no single legal dispensary operating in Michigan. As such, there's a discrepancy between when medical cannabis is approved and when medical cannabis actually becomes accessible in the form of a dispensary. Michigan is not the only state that is like that. I've brought you a map that shows that discrepancy. I'm showing you states that have medical cannabis laws, darker states have adopted them later. And I've overlaid them with a map of counties where you can actually find a dispensary. And so you see that even though many states have medical cannabis laws, very few counties actually have dispensaries. Now, just to be clear, I have not yet managed to collect all the data for California. We understand California medical cannabis has been legal there for a long time, so lots of dispensaries to find. And the ones you see in Michigan, these are applications for dispensaries. They are likely to open up by the end of this year. So now the question becomes, if you are a doctor in Garlin County, Arkansas, for example, Did you see an increase in opioid-related payments after that dispensary opened up? It's still a little too early to tell because the dispensary only opened up in May. However, what we do know is that Garlin County is among the top 100 opioid prescribing counties in the nation. We also know that doctors in Garlin County, on average, only received $12 in opioid-related payments, which is very little. We understand, given the high demand for opioids, just not a whole lot of need for advertising. Now, only time will tell whether opioid-related payments change as a result of this dispensary opening. And thanks to this very detailed data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, I'll be there to answer that question. All right. The point of this talk is this, and I guess after 10 to 15 minutes, I'm finally getting there. Individuals, you, me, pharma companies, and doctors, we all respond to incentives. Economists know about this since at least 1776, not because America gained independence that year, but because Adam Smith wrote about the invisible hand driving individual behavior. But economists also know that every incentive that is being provided always triggers an unintended consequence. So we need to be very careful which incentives we provide and to whom. Living in a world where people feel increasingly entitled to their own personal facts creates a wedge between what is true and what is personal opinion. And while it can be very annoying to deal with this type of dissonance at the dinner table, there are institutions and individuals out there whose discrepancy between what they're doing and what they're supposed to be doing becomes dangerous. So whether we want to incentivize certain behavior by implementing healthcare policies, like office detailing or medical cannabis, or whether we want to talk gun legislation or whether we want to talk education policy, it's important that each one of us becomes a critical thinker again. So next time you hear a fact that squares with your personal opinion, please still think critically. At the very least, ask your doctor if this fact is right for you. Thank you.